Today's lecture will discuss the so-called theory of optimal currency areas, and the obvious question is Europe an optimal currency area? Would Europe be a candidate to have a common currency under the conditions that the theory of optimal currency areas would dictate? I'll start with a review of last lecture, and I'll then define an optimal currency area as Mundell did many years ago. It's really an old theory, 60 years plus old. It's managed to survive over all these years, so it must have something to it. We'll look at modifications and extensions of that theory in the past 60 years. And then we'll add a couple of other ideas which to the mix that will also be important for understanding why certain countries that obviously didn't meet the Mundell criteria could still have a justification for joining. And this involves basically when a country's own central bank is so at a loss to convince the agents that it will create money in a responsible and stable way, it basically might make sense for it to give away this responsibilities to a third party. And that's, of course, what happens when you have fixed exchange rates, but this is the ultimate fixed exchange rate. This is, as Mundell himself would say, adopting the currency of another country. And to understand this, we'll use the Barro-Gordon model, which I will explain in detail. We'll do a bit more explanation of why the exchange rate as an adjustment mechanism, as Mundell stressed, is so important. And this is particularly interesting because looking at the adjustment of the euro area, within the euro area, adapting the exchange rate in real terms to imbalances is not an easy mechanism. Since you don't have the nominal exchange rate anymore, you have one less nominal quantity or price that you can change. The home and foreign price levels have to do all the work. So understanding how that works is kind of important. And one of the reasons it takes longer, as it has in Europe, is because many goods are just not traded. So for these prices to fall to a market clearing level, we would require more time, and many of these prices are administered, or they don't have any foreign competition, so this process of price adjustment just takes longer. And then, of course, at the end of this lecture, I'll talk about whether Europe qualifies as an optimal currency area using these ideas. So last time we talked about, we discussed the European monetary system, the exchange rate intervention mechanism, sometimes it's called the ERM or the ERM, and why it eventually disappeared, and the euro came to be implemented. And this basically is a function of the speculative attacks that can occur. So keeping that in mind, that's the reason why either you move forward to a common currency or you move backward to a system of independent central banks with all the consequences that we see and know from the Mundell-Fleming model to bear, which would mean that it's very difficult and very costly to maintain a system of fixed exchange rate regimes as were maintained back in the days of the ERM, as well as the European monetary system in general. And the ECB basically can be thought of as just a natural development. Instead of the ECU, the euro was implemented one-to-one, so there was really no adjustment. This was done in a very technically brilliant way, which led to the introduction of the central bank currency we know as the euro, as well as the ability of commercial banks to price or to issue liabilities and hold assets that are denominated in the currency, the euro, and eventually by 2002, this became the currency of the European monetary system. Now let's remind ourselves why we care about this? Because there are disadvantages and advantages of both, and it's always an empirical question. So ultimately, we're asking the question, let's go to the extreme and have a fixed exchange rate regime that's so fixed that we can never change it unless we dissolve the currency and introduce a new currency. It's a fairly credible event. So the fixed exchange rate regime offers some sort of insurance or buffering against financial shocks domestically, but internationally to the extent that the common regime is facing the same shock. And it would in the case of a common currency, but real shocks tend to be aggravated. We saw that in the very clear case when the interest rate can't rise or because capital is perfectly mobile within the region, the monetary union or in a fixed exchange rate regime. This causes the effect of shifts in the IS curve or the level of real aggregate demand, holding interest rates constant to increase. This effect tends to be magnified, so the full multiplier is felt in the event. So it can also provide stability of the real exchange rate regime, which means stable real exchange rates that we saw before can mean that businesses have more incentives to diversify production and invest abroad, abroad meaning in other regions that share the same fixed exchange rate regime. The disadvantages, of course, we know from our reading of Milton Friedman, having a common currency or giving up your autonomy means that you can't control monetary policy, you can't control interest rates, you really have to accept what the world serves up or what the rest of the monetary union serves up. And therefore, restoring monetary autonomy would be one argument to have flexible exchange rates if you thought the people in the country wanted to have their own monetary policy. It's also a buffer against real shocks. If these shocks impinge on the country in question, the exchange rate can help adjust in the short and medium term to these shocks. On the other hand, it leads to inefficiency in the sense that there's a large amount of uncertainty. Planning for foreign market incursions can be difficult because you can build a factory and suddenly there's an appreciation of the local currency, and as a result, the investment project is no longer profitable. This is the kind of thing that leads to the need to hedge, to offset risks. And if you ask banks to do this, this costs money, costs real money, and that means that it may not be so profitable. And certain gains from trade may actually not be realized. Okay, so to me, the best example of where this has worked is to look at the French-German real exchange rate. Here, basically, from the German perspective, how many French francs did it cost to buy a Deutsche Mark up until the euro was introduced in 1999 in the books of the balance of the banks and the central banks, and in 2002 in terms of cash. You can see that before 1999, the real exchange rate, which is nothing but sigma. Sigma is the price level at home times, divided by the price level abroad, adjusting for the nominal exchange rate. And in that case, not using the European terms from the German perspective, it would be the British terms, meaning that if it goes up, it's an appreciation. You can see that at the time of the EMS, there was quite a bit of fluctuation in real exchange rates. Okay, so adopting the euro means that S is no longer equal to 3.4, rather it's equal to 1, because both countries gave up their national currencies and used a single common currency. So the ratio of prices at home and abroad is sufficient to capture what sigma is all about. So before 1999, there was quite a bit of fluctuation. You can see that during the Mitterrand years, there was a big depreciation of the French franc, and during other years there was an appreciation. So this is not exactly the greatest news for producers in France that want to sell into Germany or vice versa. Upon introduction of the monetary union, you can see that things become quite stable because there is no nominal exchange rate anymore to talk about. So this is clearly an improvement from this perspective of those people dealing in both countries, and also for tourists, purchases of services at the site. You can debate whether one is more important than the other, but in the times of fluctuations, a fair number of foreign exchange dealers were making money off of exchanging, and I don't mean just cash, I mean bank balances. So if you were a German importer, you wanted to buy some French inputs, you'd have to convert your Deutsche Marks into French francs, and that would cost possibly 10% of the price, depending on the particular period we're looking at. In later years, towards the end, things got more efficient, there's more competition, but there has to be a compensation for the market maker in this case. If you look at the UK versus Germany, you see that this turbulence has never stopped. So until today, and especially after Brexit, huge swings in the nominal exchange rate translated at sluggish prices into very large swings in the real exchange rate, which meant that British importers, British exporters, German importers to Britain, from Britain, or exporters to Britain, really felt the full blow of these swings, and they can be quite significant. As you can see, between 1995 and 2000, the real value of sterling vis-a-vis Germany changed by roughly 30, possibly 40%. So, you know, these are things that a country has to deal with, and it may really be costly, especially if you're a small, open economy. Case of Sweden, still Sweden opts for a flexible exchange rate, but because it's much more open and more integrated with the rest of Europe, these fluctuations are smaller, yet they are significant. So Sweden insists on having its own monetary policy, but still manages to keep the real exchange rate swings in check because it has a very consistent and Taylor rule guided monetary policy. Here's the case of Poland. Poland is not a member of the euro area, and it's not fixing its exchange rate to the D-mark or to the euro, but it looks like it. And this is simply because the level of goods market integration is so advanced in Poland now that these fluctuations, while they still take place, are relatively small in magnitude. Now, some people might say that this really means that the Polish central bank is actually fixing the euro exchange rate, but that technically is not the case. This is just because the shocks that impinge on Poland and Germany and Central Europe in general tend to be quite synchronized. That's a very important point we'll talk about later. Greece, on the other hand, okay, so these are seasonally unadjusted data, but you see there's quite a bit of fluctuation, starting with the advent of the financial crisis in Greece, which can be pegged to the years 2010 to 2012. And during that period, the Greek real exchange rate was considerably overvalued. Okay, so from the Greek perspective, the German basket of goods was rather cheap, but this was not because the Greeks were particularly productive or had a terms of trade advantage. It was really because that over the years, the Greek rate of inflation was significantly higher, accumulated over the period that led to the sovereign debt crisis in 2009, 2010, 2011. Okay, so these are the things we have to deal with. Persistent differences in inflation rates can lead to a situation like this. And it's clearly, when you look at Greece now, even though things have improved considerably, the literal economic depression that they went through is an indication that maybe a common currency is not for everyone. Okay, so again, going back to ASAD, it's really easy to understand what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a leftward shift in the AD curve under conditions of fixed exchange rates, meaning that the foreign rate of inflation pi star is the anchor of the aggregate demand curve, and a shift leftwards of aggregate demand that's exogenous would mean that point B, the intersection of supply and demand, is going to lead to a situation where there's a significant differential between inflation at home and abroad. We know that can't persist for a long time because it leads to a serious overvaluation or an undervaluation. Here, at point B, what we observe basically is a reduction of inflation in the country that's been hit by the negative shock, and then we observe a process by which, by virtue of the inflation rate in Greece being lower than in Germany over time, this should accumulate to a competitive advantage, which would cause the AD curve to shift back to the right. At the same time, the Greek consumer and the Greek household will be expecting lower inflation and will adjust their wage demands and their price-setting behavior to reflect this. So you have something like a movement that we see there. It's more likely to be a spiral because at some point there'll be a period when the Greek economy is more competitive, and there may even be a rightward shift of the AD curve that goes beyond the original condition, the initial position of the curve in this diagram. Okay, so that adjustment process is the equilibrating force that we're looking for, and we called it nominal wage and price adjustment. Okay, we also saw there was labor mobility involved, possibly as a helpful adjustment process. We saw that capital mobility could also obviate the need for adjustment or accelerate the adjustment. Labor mobility would mean that in this case, Greece losing workers to Germany and to France, but also some German and French investors would move capital to Greece. These two forces have actually occurred. We've seen this in the past 10 to 15 years since the great financial crisis, but it's only accelerated in recent years because things like investment and human capital mobility, as we learned earlier, are investment decisions and are based on long-term considerations. People don't migrate at the drop of a hat. Okay? If a country has access to fiscal policy, which it might in a monetary union, if it has fiscally sound finances and is able to borrow in capital markets, then it could actually act directly against this leftward shift of aggregate demand, which I've just taken as given, and push the AD curve back relatively quickly. But of course, you have to pay for that. You have to borrow money if a government is facing a budget constraint. It might be getting transfers from some central government, but in the case of Europe, that's not the case. Okay, so these are the things that are going to guide our discussion of what an optimal currency area is. Let me just explain that the original theory goes back to Robert Mundell in 1961. But it wasn't the beginning, it was just the beginning of this discussion, which was extremely overdue. And Mundell has, in his lifetime, pushed the idea of having a single world currency, either an opt-in situation, for example, like the US dollar. Panama and Liberia and other countries, Zimbabwe at times, could opt in and use this currency. But of course, issuing the currency, as we saw earlier, has certain advantages. But Mundell was interested also in the risk performance of a monetary union, and therefore in the 1970s he proposed thinking about the diversification advantages of having a monetary union in addition to the advantages that I'm going to speak of in a second. And there are two extensions I'd like to talk about by McKinnon and Peter Kennan, and I'll also talk about this so-called credibility gain that's in the background. Okay, so to start with, let's talk about what an optimal currency area could mean. First, we have to define a region. A region is a geographic entity, and it's basically defined and could be defined under historical, cultural, or ethnic factors, but more likely it has to do with factor mobility in the case of what we're dealing with. So basically think of labor and capital being more mobile for whatever reasons within a region than outside the region. Okay, so this could be because of religious reasons, more likely to have historical, cultural, or even language-related underpinnings. Okay, so these are the reasons why we have regions. In Europe, we have many regions within a country that where people note that they can't understand each other because they have a very strong accent. Think about Bavaria or Baden-Württemberg, but think also of France, the Basque region, France, or there are many other examples that one could name. So this may or may not coincide with the existence of a nation, and that gives us the key to understanding why it was possible for Europe to adopt a common currency. And there may be other interests as well. So national sovereignty may be one expression, but maybe there's an overriding regional or national identity or a supranational identity. For example, Europe, maybe there's certain public goods that can be provided at the European level. That could also be another factor to consider. So we won't be talking about nations or countries necessarily, but in many cases it just happens to be the way it happens. So what did Robert Mundell say in 1961? He defined an optimal currency area as a set of regions, using our definition of regions, for which introducing a common currency does not reduce welfare for any single region and raises it for at least one. Okay, so one might immediately ask, at what time horizon was Robert Mundell talking about? Well, he wasn't particularly specific. So if we want to be friendly to Robert Mundell, we could say in the long run. After all the adjustment and pain has been borne out, you have this sort of like a Pareto optimality condition. Now, if you look at Greece, for example, you see that Greece had a very good run for the first 8 years, possibly 9 years, probably 8 years. And then it had basically a depression. So if you ask the average Greek person, they're not going to necessarily have a positive view of the euro. When my own personal travels there have shown that there's quite a bit of graffiti around Ammoniaplatz, Ammonia Square, that basically purports that the euro was a terrible idea and that should be abolished immediately. So Mundell's idea, we're going to take this with a grain of salt. I'm going to talk about the long run and hope that maybe I can convince you that at least at that level we can understand Mundell's criteria for an optimal currency area as being robust. Okay? So Mundell said two things have to be present in some combination. And I'll tell you what that means in a second. In some combination, meaning that one or both of these criteria have to hold. Mundell talked about high degree of factor mobility between regions, so that capital and labor can move readily between region A and region B to respond to shocks that would give rise to this mobility. And the fact that it can occur means that those types of mobility can be a sort of a safety valve in the adjustment process. And the second, which is even more interesting, because Mundell was thinking in a world of Keynesian macroeconomics when prices are fairly rigid in nominal terms, in terms of the money unit, Mundell saw basically the need for a currency devaluation in the event that one region was hit by a shock and the other wasn't. So he saw the symmetry of shocks as being critical. You could get rid of the idea of having your own currency if there's no need to use that exchange rate that you would have under the conditions of your own currency in the event of an asymmetric shock. So Mundell saw currency devaluation as a way of substituting basically for adjustment, and under Keynesian conditions, P and P star are relatively rigid, and therefore a change in S would give an ability to accelerate the movement that we saw of the AD curve in the example I gave. Okay, so nominal rigidities give rise to a value, a shadow value, if you like, of a nominal exchange rate in the event that your region is hit by a shock that does not hit the other regions that are potentially in this currency union. Okay, so let's just think about Germany and France, right? One way of interpreting this diagram is that, Germany and France are hit by shocks. And sometimes these shocks are just France, sometimes they're just Germany. But in the event that they're actually they're common to both, then there's no real reason that France and Germany should use or need a bilateral exchange rate to adjust to deal with these shocks as a policy instrument. Okay, so I mean that's a fairly reasonable set of conditions. You can imagine that if you look at this picture, the shocks that hit France and Germany must be pretty symmetric, or must have become very symmetric because of trade integration or because of coordination of policies, or even just abandoning any sort of unilateral policy which would lead to this symmetry of shocks. Now Mundell, as I said, went further and argued that financial integration is also a criterion to be considered, and he talked about the degree of capital mobility, financial capital in particular, but also the ability to hold real assets in other parts of the world as a way of diversifying risk among people living in this candidate union of regions for monetary union. And to the extent that this financial integration can be enhanced or enabled by having a common currency, it should be a good idea. Okay, so a great example would be if France and Germany have a single banking market for banking services, then French banks could go to Germany and offer their services, and German banks could go to France and offer their services. This would increase competition, reduce margins, increase consumer surplus, but it would also allow French people to buy German assets and vice versa, and that would increase the diversification and reduce consumption risk that workers might be facing. Okay? We see this in the convergence of interest rates. We saw those immediately following the euro, so Mundell actually gets credit for that, but there are also risks. So when you sort of erase financial frictions between two regions, you also make it very easy to pull the plug if you get nervous, just as we saw in the case of bank runs in a domestic market. Countries can face a so-called sudden stop where people just pull their money out. And if you have a common currency, it's much easier to pull your money out of a foreign country if you get nervous. Just as we saw in the case of Denmark, you can have a flow of capital coming in, which can overwhelm the central bank being forced to buy those reserves. If you look at the history of the European monetary union, which began, as I said, in 1999 in the balance sheets of the banks, but in your pockets, it started in 2002. You can see that at 2002, the interest rate spreads between various 10-year government bonds was negligible, even between Greece and Germany at the time. So people had this, either they were operating under a delusion that there was no risk differential between the two, or they thought the governments would bail each other out serially in case of a crisis. But this turns out to be completely wrong. A lot of people lost a lot of money holding Greek debt. A lot of insurance companies and banks, some needed to be bailed out by their respective governments as the market fled and sold the sovereign debt of Greece, Spain, Ireland, and Italy, of course. Okay, so this is be careful. It's not all obvious. Okay, so an additional criteria for a currency union area would be related to the work of Jeffrey Sachs and to some extent Martin Feldstein maybe, but also Charles Wiplow's, basically the existence of a tax and Barry Eichengreen also, tax and transfer mechanism to smooth shocks across regions might exist. The existence of this system would help if you like, smooth the adjustment, because as a matter of agreement, those countries hit by a negative shock would get a boost from the countries that are at the time are doing well, and under the assumption that everyone sort of pays in a fair premium for this type of insurance, it can work. In the United States, it works like a top, because the federal government can intervene in every state, just like the Obama government, the Obama administration had intervened to pick up the pieces of General Motors in 2009, or the Bush administration could pump money into California and Texas to support their flagging economy through fiscal policy projects, military projects. This type of system obviously doesn't exist in Europe. People are talking about getting it, but it could also work passively through the tax system. If you pay a progressive tax, meaning that if the marginal tax rate rises with the tax liability or the level of activity, then booming countries will, in general, pay more into the pot than countries that are doing badly. So this would imply that as long as everyone does well, sometimes there won't be an explicit transfer, and everything should just be fine. Now, there's also the problem of reputation. I alluded to that at the beginning of the lecture. Reputation can matter. So these factors, reputation problems, usually are introduced when a country has problems with their own monetary policy. People don't trust the money because they don't trust the government. Many countries in the world today have very high inflation rates because the central bank has been forced by the government in some way to increase at an increasing rate the supply of liquidity and supply of reserves to the banking system. Keep interest rates low, lower than they should be, given the inflation rate means that ultimately inflation will occur. A great example of that is, of course, in our part of the world is Turkey. So McKinnon basically came up with this idea that basically it's not enough just to look at the symmetry of shocks. McKinnon also looked at the openness of the economy. So in addition to the idea of credibility, you can also ask, maybe small economies have a different set of choices than a closed economy. So under the assumption that everyone's trading something, the more closed an economy is, the more non-traded goods there are likely to be. And these non-traded goods, by virtue of their very nature, will have less competition, and changes in the exchange rate will be useful in tilting the terms of trade against non-traded goods. Otherwise, these prices won't fall as fast as they would under conditions of trade. The best way of thinking about this is the price of a haircut in Berlin is not immune from the price of haircuts in the surrounding suburbs of Berlin, whereas the price of haircuts in Germany, on average, is pretty much unaffected by the price of haircuts in Italy or France, I would claim. Okay, more so for things like taxi rides or hotel rooms or rent. Okay, so small economies are less likely to benefit from having a flexible exchange rate at any time. So if you're a small open economy, it's more likely that a fixed exchange rate is not going to hurt you very much. You're not going to get much out of the devaluation option. Okay, so this is a very reasonable idea. McKinnon was also a supporter of fixed exchange rates, as Robert Mundell was. Now, Ronald McKinnon also derived this logic, as I said, basically about trying to tilt the price of non-traded goods in the direction of creating more aggregate demand and making the economy's exports more attractive. And one way to do that is to get if you're an overvalued currency, you need to get your non-traded goods cheaper and relatively quickly. Okay, so a devaluation has the same effect, inducing what we call an internal devaluation within the country. Now, Peter Kinnan talked about the diversification factor. So he basically said that, argued that devaluation would be less likely to be useful if a country with considering a common currency is undiversified and faces a single product that has a rigid nominal price. Now, if you think about it, countries that are highly diversified are usually producing primary products, intermediate goods that are traded on world markets. So this seems to be kind of an irrelevant point for those countries. But if you're producing goods that, luxury products, for example, then you could imagine that these prices are relatively rigid and may be affected in real terms by a devaluation. Okay, so he argued that small economies should have floating rates. Okay, but I'm particularly unconvinced by this argument in recent years. People still talk about it, so it's really an empirical question. So let's talk about the benefits and the costs of a currency area as a summary. This comes from the book. I put this down here as something to help you study for the exam. Lower transaction costs, reduced uncertainty, quality of monetary policy, i.e. credibility. Costs of a common currency area might be shocks that are asymmetric and the lack of the ability to use the nominal exchange rate, and the notion of having symmetry. Symmetry may also affect the responsiveness of the shocks, of the economy to the shocks. And then finally, which I think is also interesting, countries may have different preferences. So some countries might prefer to have a higher inflation rate. They may think it's not so bad compared to having the adjustment necessary to get inflation down. So these are things that have to be sorted out by the political process. So you can see that shocks can also be political. A political shock can also lead to a very large movement in the exchange rate. This is Brexit. After the vote in 2016, June is all pretty much almost exactly 7 years ago. Wow. I gave this course 7 years ago, and we were all just picking up our jaws off the floor because we couldn't believe that it actually happened. But you can see that the markets reacted in a very punishing way, and I just heard this is over the course of a week. Okay, so over the course of the last 7 years, the United Kingdom has probably lost about, relative to its trend or relative to a counterfactual of not leaving, has lost possibly 5 to 7% of GDP. Per capita, however you want to slice it, it's a lot of GDP. It's a lot of welfare because Britain is now trading at higher prices, importing goods from the EU at higher prices, and having more difficulty exporting its goods to the EU. And this includes the Republic of Ireland, as we know. Okay, so let's just give a quick summary. And then I'll go into the credibility gains. That's the last point. So we have Mundell, we have Kennan, we have McKinnon, and then we have Sachs and Krugman, the idea of having a tax and transfer scheme. I also mentioned Wyplows and Feldstein, but I think Sachs and Krugman are the right people to associate with that idea. And then this notion of Baldwin, Wyplows, that common preferences would matter, in particular for demands for insurance, preference for low inflation, and preference for redistribution and political issues. So you can see that having a European common currency is not a trivial matter. You just look at those criteria, wow. And then finally you have the last point, which is credibility. So does my central bank that I have right now, is it just not cutting the mustard in terms of reaching low unemployment, low inflation, and what can I do about it? So the way of thinking about this is that joining the monetary union for a country like Greece was a way of getting its inflation rate down in a credible way. Just telling your citizens we're going to have low inflation doesn't work. And you have to do something, and doing something can be quite painful. So one relatively less painful way of doing it is to adopt a currency over which you have no longer have control. Okay, so think about the Treaty of Maastricht and the criteria for convergence and joining as a way of enforcing credibly, because you can't just join the monetary union. You have to do what it takes, and that takes several years of keeping your inflation rate low. We talked about that last week. And getting your long-term interest rates down, because that reflects market expectations of your future inflation rate and your future nominal interest policy. So how do we think about this in terms of the ASAD framework? Well, it turns out that Robert Barro and David Gordon about 40 years ago proposed a very beautiful model, incredibly simple but not simplistic, that actually gives you an idea of how to think about this. It's a way of exploring the idea of why it makes sense to tie your hands to the mast. If you join a monetary union, you're literally tying your hands behind your back, and you as a country can no longer just reduce interest rates because you felt like it, or increase the inflation rate because you don't care. Rather, you've tied your hands, and this is what's called credibility. So Barro-Gordon is a way of understanding why this can benefit a country, and not joining a monetary union. If your country has a central bank with a bad reputation, or a reputation for having the wrong preferences, would lead to a bad outcome. Okay, so what do we need for that? We need the ASAD model. So we've taught this already. We've talked about it. We need an anchor for the AS curve, which is the expectation of inflation that is held by the workers and the firms that operate in this country. Okay, think of that as underlying inflation, as we call it. You can think, some people call it core inflation. It's kind of a misnomer, because sometimes core inflation is used to refer to non-commodity prices, inflation. Or you can call it inflationary expectations. It's generally the rate of inflation that is incorporated in contracts and people's behavior that is based on the current regime and the current expectations of the future. Okay, the central bank controls the inflation rate itself by the choice of its target inflation. Just like before, if the central bank increases the target rate of inflation, that means it's going to reduce the nominal interest rate to get inflation up to its target level. Okay, so think of that as just a way of understanding the position of the AD curve. And the third premise is that agents can understand this model. So if you talk to agents who live in countries where central banks have misbehaved over the decades, they talk like this. They expect bad behavior. It's just their baseline forecast. Okay, the worst case would be Zimbabwe in 2008. And if agents, and this is because agents have a stake. They have skin in the game. They don't want to lose their fortune because they're holding paper money. Okay, so they will behave in a way that's consistent with trying to protect their wealth for their own benefit. So to do this, we need the ASAD model, and we have to remind ourselves, what does it mean for the central bank to be expansionary? Basically means that it increases its target rate of inflation, meaning that for the next 200 years, it's going to accept a higher rate of inflation, even when the economy has achieved its output gap again of 0. When the economy resumes its steady state behavior, the inflation rate will be permanently higher. So it means the central bank is doing all it takes to make the inflation rate higher, including accepting a nominal interest rate that reflects fully through the Fisher principle this increased target rate of inflation. So the intersection at the top above the green dot would be the long-run equilibrium of a country that goes from a target rate of pi bar to pi bar prime. Okay, so that's the framework. That's the temptation, because the notion is simply that central banks have a temptation to stimulate the economy, even in the short run, okay, at the expense of higher inflation, because they're under pressure. Maybe the prime minister has told them to do it. Maybe somebody is corrupt in the administration, or maybe they just have fundamental preferences and beliefs that it's great just to stimulate the economy when they can. So how do we capture that? We capture that using indifference curves or iso-utility contour diagrams. This is what Barro and Gordon basically did. They said, look, we know that central banks have different preferences. Some accept that they can't ever increase output in the long run over and beyond the zero output gap level, or they might say, well, I know I can't do it for the long run, but if I can get away with it just for a few periods, I'd really be very happy at B. Okay, and I'm willing even to trade off some inflation for that. So these contours basically reflect combinations of inflation and output gap that yield the same level of utility. So this is like looking at a hill from above, and these lines indicate the altitude of the hill, the height of the hill. And at point B, we have what's called the bliss point. That's the highest level of utility the central bank could achieve. So the central bank doesn't love inflation, but the central bank says, well, if you tell me I can get zero inflation and I can get a positive output gap, then I would make a lot of people happy. I would be happy, my boss would be happy, I would be happier. Okay, so that would be preferences that reflect a bias towards inflation. Why? Because if I can get output up with a surprise inflation, I can possibly achieve a lower or a contour curve that's closer to B. I say it's lower. It's actually implying a larger output gap at the expense of some inflation. Okay, so think of these indifference curves or these indifference contours as basically a measure of utility of the central banker or the politicians that are directing the behavior of the central bank. Okay, so that means basically, simply, that as I move away from B, I'm less well off, I'm worse off, but there are combinations of higher inflation and higher output gap, or lower inflation, higher output gap, that all give the same amount of utility. And by construction, when you accept that, you can have a formal mathematical expression of these contours as parabolas or as concentric circles or some other unusual looking curve, as long as they have certain basic shapes. And this one is the one that we want to have. So this is kind of drawn in a fairly abstract way with the highest point of highest utility being represented by point B. Okay, so now let's consider the central bank. The central bank is facing this situation. You can see, just by looking at it, that moving from the first dot at the intersection of pi bar, its inflation target at zero output gap, to a position to the northeast of that implies higher utility. How do I know that? Well, I know that the indifference contour that corresponds to the second dot is closer to B. The point that we started with does not have an indifference contour drawn for it, but you can imagine it's somewhere between the outmost drawn contour and the next one. So I'm improving. If I can somehow get to that second green dot, I would make the central bank and the government and the politicians better off. So why not do it? Why not stimulate the economy by one day getting up and saying, okay, we're going to lower interest rates. We may not even say that we're increasing the target rate of inflation, but it's isomorphic to that. It's the same thing. So they get up and they say, okay, we're going to lower interest rates like our friend in Turkey did, and that means that basically people observe a boom in output, positive output gap relative to the long-run trend, an increase in inflation, okay? And the central bank chooses this point because at that point the slope of the aggregate supply curve, which you can think of as the marginal rate of substitution or transformation that the economy offers between inflation and output gap, and my own marginal rate of substitution as per my preferences are equal. So I would try to get to this tangency point, which I've conveniently drawn here as a single point. And of course, if the curves are well behaved, there will be exactly one point. So what does this mean? This means that the public is having a party right now with a boom and a slightly higher inflation rate, not a fully higher inflation rate, because if agents accept and expect the the correct rate of inflation, the target rate of inflation of the central bank, the AS curve has to move to the left. That is to say, pi tilde is too low. It's not consistent with the central bank's policies. Okay? So taking pi tilde as given, we fool the agents into working harder and accepting higher inflation, and maybe the politicians are happier, maybe people are just having a great time, but eventually people start to wake up to the fact that inflation is higher than they expected. Pi tilde is the expected rate of inflation, and pi bar is what the central bank is basically going to deliver for the next 20 years. So this means that people are going to start changing their expectations of inflation. So pi tilde is no longer the correct anchor for the AS curve, and as pi tilde starts to adjust, i.e. starts to increase, the AS curve shifts to the left. So here we have the outcome in the long run. That's why I put pi infinity. The adjustment might take some time. It might actually have a snail type of path spiraling into the new equilibrium point. But you can see that basically this is an equilibrium in the sense that the central bank no longer has a temptation to do anything. The marginal rate of substitution of the supply curve, given by the supply curve, or the marginal rate of substitution along the indifference curves is equal to the marginal rate of transformation given by the supply curve of the economy, and therefore the new green dot is the equilibrium at which inflationary expectations of the people are validated in the sense that that's exactly what the central bank was planning to do anyway. Okay? So you can see that the central bank, because of its temptation and its implementation of that temptation, has actually made itself worse off, and presumably the public will not be so happy either if the central bank's preferences represent the people's preferences in any way. So the policymaker is a victim of its own bad reputation, and we end up getting this bad, high inflationary equilibrium, and that's why a country might have an interest in not being able to shift its monetary policy. By joining a common currency, there is no pi bar anymore because there is no monetary policy. Okay, so this is the idea of credibility. Expectations of behavior of the central bank, i.e. the shape of those indifference curves or indifference contours, determine the outcome. So if a country has a central bank that doesn't care about short-run deviations of output from zero, from the zero output gap, you'd expect to have less of a temptation, a more credible monetary policy. There are many examples of this in history. I won't pursue them, but we know that this is an important element of any good stabilization package. Getting inflation down means convincing people that the central bank won't come around and do this again. And sometimes it means adopting a foreign currency like Zimbabwe did in 2008. It adopted the rand and the dollar foreign currencies. Okay. So basically we know that central banks do behave like this. And indeed, if the ECB has a better Taylor rule than something that we're describing, this discretion, then it will be advantageous to adopt the rule. And if this country in question doesn't have the ability to adopt a rule, then maybe accepting that Taylor rule, which does respond to deviations of output from the zero, but not as strongly as it would in the case of just reacting to temptation, you might be able to achieve a better outcome. Okay? So this is an example of the Eurosystem's Taylor rule in the very, very beginning, when everyone denied that there was any role for output gap, expressed here as the arithmetic deviation of the logs of y and y star. This was denied by the central bank, but indeed the evidence is pretty clear that when the economy starts to slow down, the central bank tends to cut its nominal interest rates. Okay, so you can think of inflation targeting as an alternative when the central bank makes statements and publicizes them and makes it very embarrassing to violate their own target. This can be a substitute for a credible commitment in the case of monetary union. The Bank of England did this for many years, and then they gave it up. So one interpretation is that they're not credible. And if you look at the inflation data, the highest rate of inflation in the large European countries is basically the United Kingdom at the moment. So people just don't expect the Bank of England to do enough to fight inflation. Now, Italy had a very high inflation, and Greece did as well. Portugal, we saw those data earlier on in the course. These countries had a serious reason for people not to trust the monetary authority, because it was either dominated by the government or dominated by people who had no interest in stabilizing policy. For those countries, there's a certain additional reason to join a monetary union. Okay. Some countries have tried to solve this problem by going to a currency board, which means basically another version of a fixed exchange rate regime, which is credible. So you can understand this point in that context as well. So at the same time, we need to understand that adjustment in general and the slope of that supply curve is a very important factor. So the slope of that supply curve is expressing the, if you like, the willingness or ability of an economy to produce more output at a fairly stable inflation rate, because either people don't expect an increase in the inflation rate and they keep expectations constant. That would be the case of a flat curve with at any given inflation rate, or it could also be because the economy faces very little competition, and therefore in the short run, rigid prices tend to be the rule rather than the exception. So if contracts are adjusted every year, a swing in demand will just be met by an output adjustment. So understanding that is very important. This is kind of the core of macroeconomics. In a sense, you might say that under a fixed exchange rate regime that is a single currency, this price adjustment is going to take some time. So in a sense, this is kind of reminds us of what Hume said about gold flows back in the 18th century. Countries that are exporting a lot and doing well ultimately will accumulate gold, and the price of goods in terms of gold will rise, and that will make them less competitive, and that will sort of turn around the adjustment back to where the economy goes back into balance. So thinking about our particular case, the case of Greece or the case of Michigan, this would imply that countries running a deficit with their neighbors under common currency, you need to have some adjustment mechanism when the inflation rate is very sluggish. Otherwise, you're going to have very large swings in these imbalances, as well as long time incoming for the price adjustment. The way to understand this is to understand that the price adjustment itself occurs via the external value of goods and services in a region, but also within. Okay, so it comes back to my point about nominal exchange rate adjustment when you have large numbers or large volumes of non-traded goods. So think about the exchange rate that we've defined already as the product of the nominal exchange rate, the price of goods in the domestic currency divided by the price of goods in the foreign currency. Okay, so this would basically, in the case of a common currency, would be the case of S equals 1. If you look carefully at P divided by P star, there are two ways of thinking about it. One is that you think of P as being the price of the goods I export in international trade, and P star would be the price of goods that I import, including intermediate goods. Or you might think of this as the internal terms of trade, which is the price of traded goods in terms of non-traded goods. Okay, so this would be the relative price of haircuts in terms of manufacturers, for example. Okay, now how can we see this? Well, we can see this if we take the most general formulation, where the price index P and P star respectively are Cobb-Douglas indexes of non-traded and traded goods using the subscripts N and T respectively to designate that, and star refers to the foreign country. Okay, so if you just use the Cobb-Douglas, which is a nice approximation of, and it's just a geometric mean proposition for computing prices, it basically predicts that you can expand this expression along the lines of just substituting and rearranging. You can see that sigma in a common currency case would simply be the ratio of non-traded prices, non-traded goods prices raised to the alpha power, which is less than 1, greater than 0, times the price of traded goods in the common currency divided by, or relative to the price of foreign goods in the common currency raised to the 1 minus alpha power. Okay, so it's a geometric average of those two price indexes. Now, if within these two regions you have fairly free trade and there's no transactions costs or very low transactions costs, then that first ratio is equal to 1. The price of a bottle of Beck's in Berlin and the price of a bottle of Beck's in Paris are pretty much the same. That's the proposition of the law of one price. And even if that's not true, up to a multiplicative factor doesn't matter. Okay, just shifts the movement, the burden on the adjustment a bit more. But in the end, what matters is that if those two prices are constant, in constant proportion to each other, then basically all the action is occurring through the price of non-traded goods. Okay, so price of traded goods converge to each other in some reasonable way. The price of Chibo coffee in Prague is the same as the price of Chibo coffee in Germany in a common currency. Then we have the law of one price. That means that the internal rate of exchange, the internal real exchange rate, is the one that's going to matter. So you can see that for adjustment to occur, for sigma to change, Pn relative to Pn star has to change. So the price of haircuts in Germany relative to France has to change. Okay? And we know that already that things like relative wealth, productivity, transfers can also affect the price of non-traded goods. And they can also, if these factors are positive, will appreciate the real exchange rate through their effect on the relative price of non-traded goods. And what does this mean? This means that for an open economy, it's really hard to change the external terms of trade because you're trading everything. The price of haircuts gets too high in Berlin, people go to Brandenburg, get a haircut. Okay, there are few goods that are completely non-tradable. There are many substitutions. And of course, the devaluation channel would be most important there because by devaluing, you make people poor, they would buy fewer non-traded goods, they'd buy fewer all goods, and that would change the relative price of non-traded goods in terms of traded goods or vice versa. Okay, so the evidence for this has always been McDonald's Big Mac Index. So if you look at the price of McDonald's, everybody eats McDonald's hamburgers at least once in their life, and they make comparisons across countries because you can get McDo everywhere. Okay, there's no question about it. It is universally available, and it's pretty much the same stuff. You know, I mean, there's a standardized product. And the cool thing is that the standardized product is made with traded and non-traded goods. Bread is not traded. Can't trade the bun. You can make it in the bakery around the corner, but you can't ship it in from the United States. It would not be the same. Okay? So McDonald's Corporation invests a lot of money trying to make sure that the standards are held. So a lot of non-traded stuff goes into the Big Mac. And The Economist figured this out a long time ago and have published for probably 4 decades the relative price of McDonald's hamburgers in various countries after adjusting for the local exchange rate. And the idea being that if the law of one price applied all the time, the price of a Big Mac in the United States and the price of a Big Mac in Argentina would be equal, but the fact is that they're not. And that's because a lot of non-traded goods move very slowly. So if there's a depression in Argentina, Over time, the price of non-trade goods will fall. It will make Big Macs cheaper. But maybe the reason why there was an overvalued currency is because there was some inflation before, so the price of bread and other things in Argentina were rising more rapidly than the United States, meaning that the Big Mac in Argentina was high. So this chart basically shows the pink filled in boxes on the right indicate overvaluation, and the green indicate undervaluation. It turns out the Big Mac index is a great predictor of where the exchange rate is going to go over the next 3 to 5 years. So if you have an overvalued exchange rate, chances are you're going to have a devaluation, and that seems to come true almost all the time. And if you have an undervalued exchange rate, the price of your currency in terms of foreign currency will tend to rise. You'll have a real appreciation driven by a nominal appreciation over the next few years. Okay, it turns out that, and this is just for you to look at. This is 2018 showed that the U.S. dollar was actually pretty much undervalued against almost all the other currencies in the world, and it turns out that The Economist was pretty much on target for many of these relationships, but they change all the time. So you see that Switzerland is still very expensive relative to the United States, and that could be because Switzerland is just a richer country per capita and has a higher level of wealth, as Norway, as Sweden, and those will lead to permanent differences that will never be reflected by nominal exchange rates because it's an equilibrium real exchange rate. That's the Balassa-Samuelson effect in terms of productivity, or just more generally the wealth effect in international monetary economics. Okay, and here's a little bit of evidence of that. For those of you who still aren't convinced, you can take a look at this. Richer countries do have higher Big Mac prices. Okay, it's a pretty tight regression analysis by The Economist. Okay, so let's try to wrap up our discussion now before we get moving to the empirical part, because I need to move a little bit more quickly. The notion here is there a way of making sense of all these criteria? And I think this flow chart that Baldwin Whiplow's propose is quite useful. Okay, so they basically say let's take this like a decision tree and decide whether a country or 2 countries or 3 countries should be in a monetary union or not. Well, you can ask first, are they open, and do they have differentiated output, product differentiation? Okay, if the answer is yes, then do they have a low likelihood of asymmetric shocks impinging on them over time? And if the answer is yes, then OCA is optimal currency area is the right answer, or moving to a currency area would be likely to be a welfare improving move. If the answer is no, then you need adjustment, and then you need some sort of wage and price flexibility. And if wages are not flexible, then you probably need some adjustment. But if they are flexible, then you can still move to an OCA, to an optimal currency area. If you need adjustment, you're going to have adjustment in factors. So labor or capital mobility. Here they just talk about labor mobility. And if it's okay to have labor mobility, i.e. within Germany or within France or within Switzerland, then you can move to an optimal currency area. Switzerland, the union of all the cantons is an optimal currency area, or the union of the départements in France is an optimal currency area, or the union of the Bundesländer is an optimal currency. Okay? But if the answer is no, if people don't accept migration or don't want to migrate, then you need to do something. You need to do something to help the region that's struggling, and you're going to need political support. Do you have political support? If you do, you can have transfers, so you can give money in the long haul to bribe people to be happy, to have the same consumption basket as they had before, or you need to have enough homogeneity of preferences that this would come naturally. Okay, so it would be natural to have a tax and transfer system, and you need to have a feeling of solidarity with these people. So again, these last three are kind of tricky in the case of Europe, and that's where I need to get more specific. So, you know, we need to have maybe even more refinement. We need to have similarly flexible prices, because if one country has more flexible prices than the other, then that would mean a differential response and possibly a differential adjustment speed, which would not be in the sense, in the spirit of having a monetary union. And I also talked about capital mobility. You need to have, you need to think about all factors in this sense. Okay, so we can go back to the first part of the course that specifies that. And you need to have, probably, to make sure this works, you need to have some sort of central organization, because these transfers are not going to come from the goodwill of some citizens for others. It's not going to work. You need to have some organized governmental mechanism. Okay, so the first summary slide, is it logical? What conditions? Do you want to use the exchange rate? If you don't want to use it, there's no use for it and you don't need it. So it depends on openness and diversification. You need wage and price flexibility, and especially with respect to non-traded goods. You can talk about lots of different reasons why that would not be the case. You can talk about credibility gains from joining a monetary union, the Barro-Gordon model. And you can think about similar preferences for inflation and for having solidarity and fiscal policy. So let's talk about the question that's kind of driving the lecture today. In the last 15 minutes or 20 minutes, I'd like to talk about why you need to be very critical but not cynical about the European project, and why Europe might actually represent, at least in parts, a fiscal, an optimal, currency area. So the issues we talked about already: flexibility of prices, factor mobility, credibility gain, and preferences. We don't have a tax and transfer system, so as long as the European Union is not expanded to have a tax union, fiscal union, or some sort of governmental, superimposed authority, this is not going to be worth talking about. Although in the United States, this is clearly one of the most important reasons the American monetary union has been so successful. Okay, so let's talk about those questions in detail now. Okay, I should refer to this manifesto that the German economists put together. I did not sign it, but it was basically an anti-European monetary union manifesto. And if you're interested, read it. It's very, it's on Wikipedia. Those links may not be quite active anymore, but the people who originated the manifesto still exist, and they're certainly still very, very noisy. This happened 30 years ago. So a lot of the problems that we've seen were anticipated by these guys. You can't just criticize them. They criticized the fundamental idea that every European country in the EU was a natural candidate for a common currency, and they were advocating more differential response. So the first criteria is labor mobility. I'll talk about capital mobility in a second. For monetary union to function properly, labor mobility has to be there, in the sense that if there's a boom, workers need to come in, and if there's a bust, workers need to remove their labor supply. Now, this kind of goes against the European grain. Europeans like their local soccer club, and their language makes it often very difficult to move around. So these labor mobility issues are kind of all conditional on the ability of doing that, being able to speak a language that people in the other region can understand. Okay, so in the book, there's a great set of examples, and this is a study that was done originally by Fatas and a colleague, de Crescent, in the 1990s, and Fatas repeats the analysis later on. This is basically what we call vector autoregression, a structured vector autoregression experiment. And the idea is simply use the data to estimate how a shock gets worked through the system or absorbed in Europe, meaning the EU, and the United States. So what they did basically is they used this vector autoregression is simply a restricted vector autoregression of four variables: employment, unemployment rate, participation in migration as a fraction of the population, and look at the statistical behavior of those variables over time on the basis of well-defined period, and then ask the question, what would happen if one of the driving forces behind these four variables changed, and how would that track through the system? So to do this properly, you have to identify the shocks. So you have to make some assumptions about the nature of the underlying shocks. So I won't go into the details, but it means basically assuming that certain shocks affect certain variables and don't affect other variables. And these are maintained assumptions. So if they're wrong, then the analysis is no good. But they're pretty defensible. And they lead to very, very different qualitative results for the same type of data from Europe and the United States. So the thought experiment is, what would happen if there's a negative shock to employment? How does Europe, respectively the United States, work out this shock over time? So if you look at Europe, you see that employment goes down, and you see that it also goes down in the United States, and you also see that unemployment goes up in both regions. And if you don't have this, if you don't have the resolution that you need to understand this diagram, please look at the book, because the hand readings are on the handout, in the handout file or folder on Moodle. Okay, so you have an increase in unemployment, decrease in employment, and the key thing to understand here is that the qualitative difference in these two diagrams, really qualitatively different, is the migration versus the participation margin. So in the European case, what happens is that when there's a negative shock to employment that's identified, it leads to an immediate increase in non-participation. Non-participation means you stay where you are, but you don't work, and you don't look for a job. If you remember your labor economics from my course, there are three possibilities, and otherwise you're not alive. So if you withdraw from the labor force, that means you've retired, or you go into schooling, or you do something that has little or no contact with the world of work. And you see that Europe is definitely adjusting to this negative employment shock by increasing non-participation. Participation goes down. In the United States, in contrast, non-participation falls much more slowly and over a longer period of time. And what adjusts is migration. So a lot more people leave the region and move somewhere else. This could be due to American demographics. America is well known to be a younger population than Europe. That could also be part of it. It's also possibly a function of culture and a function of language. Okay, so young people finishing college are likely to leave the state, move somewhere else where the jobs are, and that is a good adjustment. So Europe doesn't really cut the mustard on this particular dimension, although maybe you don't have to have the whole population moving, you just have a segment of young people moving, and there is increasing mobility, especially in response to the financial crisis of 2008 and 9 and the sovereign debt crisis, 2010, 11, there's more mobility. Okay, capital mobility could work, but we already discussed sudden stop can be a problem. Investors could pull the plug, and then you have suddenly a shortage of financial capital in the country. The interest rates rise in anticipation of possibly an exit from the monetary union. That was the case in Europe in 2011, 2012. People really thought that euro was going to dissolve, and only through the very strong statement of Mario Draghi, which I'll talk about later, you could argue saved the European monetary union. European divergence of shocks, okay? So we talked about shocks. Are shocks converging or diverging? If you look at this plot of GDP per capita of the European countries that are kind of relevant, you can see that they're kind of growing. That's good news. So maybe we need to take logarithms of this to get an idea. So if you just look at that, you'd get the impression of growing dispersion. If you take logs, you actually get an impression of convergence, slow sigma convergence up until around 2010. Okay, and then things seem to have gotten stagnated. If you look at Luxembourg, things got worse, but Luxembourg is a very small drop in the bucket of very, very rich people. We can ignore that. But overall, there's been very little progress. So maybe on the basis of shock convergence, we're not doing so well. Europe may not cut the mustard either. And again, you don't have to have the entire European Union pass the test. It's just a matter of some countries passing the test. So, which countries? Famous study by Manfred Neumann and Jürgen von Hagen in 1994. It's a very interesting study that I often ask my students to try to replicate. Occasionally it actually happens with newer countries. So the idea here is simply to ask, what would happen if we took the Bundesländer as benchmarks for symmetry of shocks? Because Germany has a common currency and has had a common currency for many years. Here, these German states, Bavaria, Berlin, Baden-Württemberg, Hesse, North Rhine-Westphalia, and Saarland have been in Germany since West Germany was founded. The Bundesrepublik Deutschland was founded in 1949. Okay, so what is the volatility of sigma between these states? Okay, so that's an already interesting question. Is it true that the price level in Bavaria and the price level in Berlin actually get out of whack? Okay, so the way they measured this is they looked at the standard deviation of the real exchange rate, and they would take each one of these countries and the standard deviation of the relative exchange rate between Bavaria and Berlin, Baden-Württemberg, Hesse, North Rhine-Westphalia, Saarland, and then basically calculate the standard deviation of the monthly changes of those data over the period. So this is the period 1973 to 1978. This is when Europe left the Bretton Woods system, was kicked itself out of the Bretton Woods system. America gave up the Bretton Woods system, and basically Europe was on its own. So within Germany, there was no exchange rate volatility because it was a single German mark. Deutsche Mark was the same, so you could calculate it as a benchmark. And the question is, okay, in these turbulent 70s, we had volatility of relative prices even within this small subset of German states. Okay, and we're measuring this now as in mils. So this is like when you see 16, it's like 16 thousandths of a percentage or 1.6% deviation, standard deviation. Okay, so this is kind of the benchmark. If anything, these countries or regions should qualify for monetary union. This is what happens afterwards. In the same period for other countries that are not part of the monetary union. So taking the same bilateral exchange rates of those 6 federal states, Bundesländer, with Austria, Belgium, Denmark, France, Italy, Netherlands, Luxembourg, Netherlands, and the UK, you can see that the standard deviations are quite large. Okay, so, and this is incorporating changes in S, the nominal exchange rate, as well as the price levels in the Bundesland under consideration and the respective country, i.e. Austria, Belgium, etc. So you can see these are quite large numbers, and obviously maybe you'd consider talking to Austria, but even then, Austria is a much more volatile real exchange rate measured on average between these 6 German states than the German states themselves. So the question is, what happened afterwards? We had the EMS. The EMS was introduced, and we see that things got better. Okay, the volatility of exchange rates for Austria, which ultimately joined the EMS later, but joined in a serious way, within the next 10 years, actually reduced the volatility of its exchange rate deviations with the 6 German states to the same level as the German states themselves. So Austria effectively became part of the currency union, even though it had its own currency, the shilling, okay? Because monetary union didn't occur until 1999, but you see already that the study identified that Austria had already moved towards more symmetry of shocks. If you think of shocks as being represented by fluctuations in sigma. In contrast, if you look at the other countries, things aren't so bad if you're in Luxembourg or the Netherlands, because you're getting to the level that Berlin and Bavaria had in the beginning of the period. So obviously this fluctuation in sigma is endogenous. And as trade integration and stable exchange rates increase trade integration over time, the symmetry of the shocks hitting these regions increases. We don't see the same effect for the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom had exposure to the price of oil because of its oil activities and also fairly erratic economic policy, whereas the Netherlands looks very, very similar to Austria. France looks very similar. Italy, nah. And this is commented on in the paper. It's not clear that Italy would have been a bona fide candidate. Italy was one of the first founding members of the European Economic Community. So it's kind of hard not to let them play since they were there from the start. But obviously, using the Mundell 1 criteria, they're not really ideal as a candidate. You can do this with quarterly data and you get the same qualitative conclusion. Other people have done the same type of analysis in a similar vein, but looking at different data sets and different types of models. Okay, so I really like this paper by Barry Eichengreen and Tam Bayumi, who try to estimate, using the same type of identified vector autoregression, estimate demand and supply shocks and see how they're correlated and see how that correlation looks. Okay, so at the same time, they take these European regions, the NUTS 2 regions, and compare them with the behavior of the U.S. census regions, which are groups of U.S. states, okay? So here's what they find. They find that the correlation of demand and supply shocks in the European, if you take, instead of taking the NUTS regions, you take the European countries, you get some countries that have high correlation with Germany, okay? So Denmark, France, Belgium, Netherlands. But then if you go to the lower left, you have Ireland, Greece, Spain. These are exactly the countries that got into trouble in the late 2000 decade and had the sovereign debt crisis resulting 2009, 10, 11, okay? Here's the picture for the United States. And if you look at the scale, you see that most of the United States points are up in the 0.8, 0.7, 0.6 correlation, high correlation. Whereas for Europe, we're happy about Denmark, the correlation is 0.4. Okay, so, or 0.5. It's not quite as correlated as it is in the United States. The United States is clearly a monetary union. If you take Europe as a benchmark, Europe needs to go farther in terms of symmetry of shocks to achieve this level. You can do similar analyses looking at the standard deviation as another metric for the volatility, and you see that the European Union, just not even looking at NUTS 2 regions, not even looking at just looking at the countries, is not really cutting the mustard. Now, in the meantime, these guys have done another study. They've re-estimated this. And they actually find increased correlation with Germany. So there seems to be something going on, maybe increased integration, partially maybe driven by Mundell's idea of financial integration. And they also find something that looks like supply shocks do have some permanence, again, thinking about Greece. This is an interesting finding, which means that in some sense, monetary union may be an endogenous proposition. If countries have the will and the way, are willing to go the final mile, that they can achieve the conditions necessary for goods market integration and highly correlated shocks, and by definition, they won't need the ability to use the nominal exchange rate as an instrument. Okay, so the conclusion is that it's possible. Okay, and then going further, we can also look at the notion of fundamentals, right? This is what we call supply-side economics. I'll finish up talking about this because these are very important points that we've talked about earlier. Won't have to belabor them now. But some countries may not be suitable to join a monetary union if the long-run real exchange rate is still very far from where it's going to be. And remember, I told you already that the Big Mac index was a great indicator that underdeveloped countries will have lower price levels because their manufacturing sector is less productive, or as an adjunct to the Balassa-Samuelson effect, more wealthier countries have higher non-traded goods prices relative to traded goods that they import. And you can see this very clearly by looking at the identity of some of those points in this Big Mac index taken from January 2020. So similar levels of development, similar patterns of economic shocks, supply and demand, factor mobility, credibility of monetary policy. The last thing I'd like to mention is just having a fiscal authority. So Europe doesn't cut this mustard at all. Europe does not have a serious fiscal authority. We know from evidence from the United States and Canada that tax and transfers are cyclical, and they actually help the regions that are doing badly. And the EU just cannot cut this because of the constitution of the EU. The treaties do not provide for a very large fiscal authority. So the EU budget in total, which was designed for agricultural maintenance, agricultural price supports, in total is 1% of GDP. It's very difficult to do serious fiscal policy with 1% of GDP without being able to borrow money. So as long as Europe doesn't have a fiscal capacity to borrow money and repay it, we'll talk about this at the end of the class when we talk about the NGEU, Next Generation EU program, which has been roundly criticized, but actually could be an effort to move in this direction. But these are tied and designated projects, for example, pandemic aid, short-time work, helping countries control migration, the green transformation, these types of projects. They're not really fiscal policy in the classic macroeconomic sense. Okay, so for those who read German, this is a great example to show that obviously some countries are paying in, and if you divide by GDP, it's still quite substantial. That's part of the deal. And maybe Germany won't be on top of the heap anymore after energy prices trickle through the economy, and energy-intensive sectors have to move to other countries. So this is all, subject to change. Things can change, just like they changed before, many countries joined the European Union. Finally, credibility of monetary policy. The Barro-Gordon model you should look at carefully. EU has had a boost because the ECB running the EU that uses the euro, and even the EU parts that don't use the euro, have benefited from low inflation because the low inflation of the euro region, euro area, has increased incentives for central bankers outside the euro area to keep inflation low. Okay, because again, if you don't do that, you're going to have a problem. So this is one interpretation of Polish monetary policy independence. They don't have the euro, but they're pretending they want to have the European Central Bank target rate of inflation. Okay? The best example of seeing how this happens is to look at Italy. So Italy had a huge inflation rate in the 1970s and 80s. It joined, same is true of Greece. Greece had, in the 1990s, had high inflation. In 1989, it had 26% inflation. So there was a credibility gain of joining the euro, getting lower inflation permanently, but you have to tie your hands. You have to tie your hands like Ulysses did when he passed through the straits. If you don't know what that reference is, you should check it. It's a very interesting story. Okay, so the Eurozone has had low inflation. Now, of course, in the most recent period, we've had this surge because of the supply shocks, which were quite strong and quite devastating, actually, in the short run. But Europe is getting its act together and dealing with it. And inflation has high variability. One thing we have to worry about is that how countries can maintain their relative price stability relative to other partners, trading countries inside the European Monetary Union, because this can lead to so-called misalignments. Okay, and we'll talk about that when we talk about the financial crisis. One way of thinking about this is that back then we didn't keep our eye on the ball. German inflation was persistently lower than inflation rates in the southern countries, and this led to imbalances. And in the short run, real growth doesn't suffer, but in the long run it does, because exchange rates get out of whack. Okay, so in the case of France, you've seen this picture already, things are great. In the case of the Dutch guilder, now the euro, common currency, doesn't matter. Italian lira, you can already see the slight deviation. And then if you look at the peseta, you see that prior to the financial crisis, there was a huge appreciation of the peseta in real terms, or the euro in terms of purchasing power between Germany and Spain. Okay, I'm done. I'll talk about this when we talk about fiscal policy. To answer my question, it's not a straightforward answer to the question, Europe, optimal currency or not. It's certainly the case that the Benelux countries, France, Germany, would have made an ideal initial offer. Italy wanted to be in. Italy got in. Other countries that joined later wanted to get in. Austria wanted in. So eventually the idea had to be the promise of Maastricht that eventually a common currency would be the ideal for all. But that requires a certain number of conditions that we talk about as the optimal currency area. And one of those may actually not just be symmetric shocks, but symmetric shock resilience. So the ability of France and Germany to take the same shock might also be a part of the formula. And one has to worry that in the case of the gas price shocks that we've seen recently, France being relatively free of energy dependence on Russian gas and oil will have a different effect. It'll be a different shock, even though the price change is the same for both countries, than Germany, which would probably suffer more as a result. Okay, so here are the key concepts to remember. Please study them because they will certainly be on the final exam. See you later.